Japan played a major role in World War II, and the Second Sino-Japanese War was a reflection of Japan's imperialistic ambitions that caused it to join the war in the first place. Before the onset of World War II, however, Japan was engaged in a major conflict with China to take control of the country. Though very minor compared to World War II, this war involved great sacrifices for both nations involved. In the years leading up to World War II, Japan sought to expand their territory by taking over China. China was in the midst of a civil war that started in 1927. The conflict was between the communists, led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Both parties sought control of the federal government and had major differences in their ideologies. The nationalists wanted capitalism and democracy within the government, whereas the communists desired a communist government with an emphasis around an equal society. On April 12, 1927, fighting broke out between members of the two parties. The nationalists ended up arresting and executing numerous Communist Party members in this conflict, which was later named the Shanghai Massacre. Later on, the communists attempted to take over various cities such as Nanchang, Changsha, and Wuhan. However, they were forced out of Wuhan by the nationalists and eventually retreated underground. While underground, the communists formed a military plan to revolt against the nationalists, marking the start of the war. This civil war damaged China's unity as a nation, which made the Japanese believe that it would be much easier to invade and take over.
The primary reason that Japan was interested in China were the abundance of coal, iron, and oil, as well as cheap labor in China. This was all in an effort to remilitarize following Japan's defeat in World War I. On September 18, 1931, Japanese troops staged a bombing near a railway in the Chinese city of Mukden. Japan framed this as a Chinese attack and used it as an excuse to start the invasion of China. Within 3 months of the Manchurian incident, numerous Japanese reinforcements joined the invasion and troops spread throughout Manchuria. In 1932, the League of Nations demanded Japan to surrender Manchuria. However, the Japanese army refused to withdraw. Instead, Japan left the League of Nations and continued to slowly expand in China over the next 6 years before they faced effective Chinese resistance. This diplomatic sacrifice was the first of many in Japan's imperialistic pursuits throughout the course of the Second Sino-Japanese War. By cutting ties with the League of Nations, Japan effectively sacrificed all relationships with League members and created more opposition towards them.
On July 7, 1937, a skirmish between the Chinese and Japanese armies occurred in the suburbs of Beijing. This conflict, called the Marco Polo Bridge Incident, marked the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War and the start of Japan's full-scale invasion on China. The incident was started by a dispute over a missing Japanese soldier, and it soon escalated into a full-blown military confrontation between the two sides. The conflict lasted for several days, resulting in numerous military and civilian casualties. Just a month after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the Chinese National Revolutionary Army and the Japanese Imperial Army had their first of many major battles. The conflict, known as the Battle of Shanghai, established the dominance of the Japanese forces in the region, causing significant military losses for China and a significant sacrifice for its civilians. Many civilians were displaced from their homes, and the city's infrastructure and the economy suffered greatly. The Battle of Shanghai was a turning point in the war, underscoring the economic and civilian sacrifices that both sides endured. The Nanjing Massacre occurred on December 13, 1937, and was the capital of China. Japan won against China in this battle and successfully captured this place. However, once this was accomplished, the Japanese committed many atrocities against the civilians. They broke the laws of war as they murdered and tortured thousands of women and young girls too. The sacrifice of civilians was also apparent in this battle, as the government didn't send reinforcements to help the civilians against the war crime that the Japanese committed, and the civilians continued to suffer.
After the Nanjing Massacre, Japan continued to advance into western China. To stop the Japanese, the Chinese nationalists decided to flood the Yellow River by destroying the dikes that held it in place on June 9, 1938. The Yellow River spanned across several provinces, which led to the death of as many as 900,000 civilians. As a result of the flood, one of the main sacrifices of this war was the sacrifice of civilians. China showed that it was willing to take any measures to win the war against Japan, and they started the flood while also being aware of the fact that it would harm many civilians and their lives. Shortly after the Yellow River flood, the Battle of Wuhan took place from June 11th to October 27, 1938. The Battle of Wuhan was considered a turning point of the war, as this place was one of the last major defenses for China against Japan's expansion, and the outcome of the war would be in Japan's favor if they won this battle. Eventually, Japan would go on to win this battle, which helped them gain control over the large part of the nation, and China's resistance to Japan would continue to grow weaker. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese carried out a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, which led the United States to join the Allies and enter the war. The Allies' foreign intervention provided substantial support for China, helping to turn the tide against Japan, ultimately leading to their defeat. The U.S. also enacted an oil ban and imposed economic sanctions on Japan, both of which greatly damaged Japan's economy significantly. Also, the US, UK, and France provided loan assistance to China, helping the country militaristically and economically. All of this foreign intervention was crucial to Japan's loss in the Second Sino-Japanese War. By the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War on September 9, 1945, China regained control of its territories. China, with their large number of civilian sacrifices, Japan with their diplomatic and economic sacrifices, and both sides with their military sacrifices, showed that the war took a huge toll on both countries. Over the span of 8 years, both sides seemed to give up numerous resources in each battle fought, and can therefore be known as a war of sacrifice.
Roughly 84 years ago, soldiers were fighting for their lives as World War II, one of the biggest and most deadliest wars in the entire world, was starting to break out. But even prior to this brutality, the Holocaust had already begun. The Holocaust was a horrible time filled with segregation and mass murder, especially for the German Jewish population. This specific population was falsely accused by Hitler and his Nazi party of being the sole reason for their economic, political, and cultural problems that came to Germany as a result of their defeat in World War I. Their reason? They were an easy group of people to blame. It comes as no surprise that the Nazis were extremely anti-Semitic, but it is the way that they treated these people. And it was solely based on their religious backgrounds and other factors that make the Holocaust one of the most catastrophic and disturbing events in human history. But first, let us start from the beginning. 1933, a time when Hitler was developing his brutal regime that the world was yet to discover. The Jewish citizens were already facing his wrath, which was yet to come to the rest of the world. The Germans had suffered from many economic, social, and political downfalls after World War I, as they had lost the war. The Germans, as a result, falsely blamed the Jews as the main reason they lost the war. This is incredibly unfair towards the Jews, as they had done nothing wrong, but got condemned solely because of how small a minority they were compared to the Germans.
This didn't just stay as a belief. The Germans wove this into their Nazi ideals and socio-political ideologies and laws. More specifically, the German government released a multitude of anti-Semitic laws. The most impactful of these were the Nuremberg race laws. In essence, these laws segregated Jewish people from non-Jewish people. There were also many forms of public identification and expulsion, including anti-Semitic propaganda, boycotts of Jewish-owned businesses, public humiliation, and obligatory markings such as the Jewish star badge worn as an armband or on clothing. There was also widespread organized violence. One of the most notable events of this was the Kristallnacht. It was a pogrom, or a violent riot, against Jews carried out by the Nazi Sturmteilung paramilitary and Schutzstaffel paramilitary forces. But this was just the beginning. Now the genocide begins.
The Nazis called it Endlösung der Judenfrage, or the final solution to the Jewish question. As part of the final solution, Nazi Germany committed mass murder on a colossal, unprecedented scale. There are two main methods of killing: mass shootings and asphyxiation. German units called Einsatzgruppen began to carry out mass shootings of local Jews. At first, these units targeted Jewish men of military age, but they eventually started massacring entire Jewish communities. These massacres were often conducted in broad daylight and in full view and earshot of local residents. These operations took place in more than 1,500 cities, towns, and villages across Eastern Europe. German units tasked with murdering the local Jewish population moved throughout the region, committing horrific massacres. Typically, these units would enter a town, round up the Jewish civilians. They would then take the Jewish residents to the outskirts of the town. Next, they would force them to dig a mass grave or take them to a mass grave prepared in advance. Finally, German forces or local auxiliary units would shoot all of the men, women, and children into these pits. In late 1941, the Nazi regime began building specially designed stationary killing centers in Germany-occupied Poland. In English, killing centers are sometimes called extermination camps or death camps. Nazi Germany operated 5 killing centers: Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. They built these killing centers for the sole purpose of making it more efficient to murder Jews on a mass scale. The vast majority of Jews deported to killing centers were gassed almost immediately after their arrival. Some Jews, whom German officials believed to be healthy and strong enough, were selected for forced labor. Their labor was in service of the Axis war effort, or for the enrichment of Nazi organizations, the military, and or private businesses. Now come the ghettos. German authorities originally established the ghettos, part of a place where minorities lived, to isolate and control the large local Jewish population in occupied Eastern Europe. Initially, they concentrated on Jewish residents from within the city and the surrounding area region. However, beginning 1941, German officials also deported Jews from other parts of Europe, including Germany, to some of these ghettos. Sometimes factories and workshops were established nearby in order to exploit the imprisoned Jews for forced labor. The labor was often manual and grueling. Life in the ghettos was miserable and dangerous. There was little food and limited sanitation or medical care. Hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation, rampant disease, exposure to extreme temperatures, as well as exhaustion from forced labor. Germans also murdered the imprisoned Jews through brutal beatings, torture, arbitrary shootings, and other forms of arbitrary violence. Beginning 1941 to 1942, Germans and their allies and collaborators murdered ghetto residents and dissolved ghetto administrative structures. They called this process liquidation as part of the final solution to the Jewish question. The majority of Jews in the ghettos were murdered either in mass shootings or nearby killing sites or after deportation to killing centers.
6 million lives were lost. That was the approximation of the final death toll to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust carried out by the Nazis. Nazi Germany and its allies and collaborators had devastated or completely destroyed thousands of Jewish communities across Europe. Those Jews who survived were often confronted with the traumatic reality of having lost their entire families and communities. Some were able to go home and choose to rebuild their lives in Europe. Many others were afraid to do so because of the post-war violence and anti-Semitism. In the immediate post-war period, those who could not or would not return home often found themselves living in displaced persons camp. So throughout all of this, the Germans sacrificed nothing to murder the Jews. It was pure, cold genocide, just for the sake of blame aversion.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest-running battle of World War II, lasting from the 1st of December 1939 to May 8, 1945. It was a naval conflict between the Allies and the Axis powers, specifically the German U-boats and the British Navy. The outcome of this battle will determine the fate of the war, as it will control the supply line for the troops and resources. The German U-boats, or submarines, targeted merchant ships carrying supplying from North America to Britain. The British Navy, along with their allies, fought to protect these convoys and defeat the U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic was a grueling and treacherous conflict that tested both sides, but in the end, the Allies ultimately won, securing the supply lines and paving the way for a successful outcome in the war. Dr. Serrett, a historian, has a firm grasp on the tactics of anti-submarine warfare as he published a book titled The Defeat of the German U-Boats, which eventually became the Allies' top priority in defeating Hitler.
I focused particularly on the ability of aircraft to overcome the early successes of Admiral Dönitz in his deployment of wolf packs of U-boats, utilizing their superior surface speed to launch night attacks on the lumbering convoys. In 1942, these had led to such heavy sinkings as to cast doubt on the future efficiency on the convoy as the only reliable method of protecting merchant shipping. The convoy system, a group of ships sailing together for protection, was designed to help protect cargo and passenger ships during the First and Second World War. The system was created out of desperation as merchant ships were being hunted too quickly for any other strategies to be devised. As the fall of France on July 17, 1940, only Britain and its Commonwealth allies were left to fight against Germany and Italy. With the German occupation of Western Europe, Britain was completely dependent upon supplies and resources shipped from North America. As a result, hundreds of merchant vessels were organized into convoys that departed from ports of Halifax and Sydney, Nova Scotia.
The Atlantic Gap was a critical vulnerability stretching some 600-700 nautical miles long in the North Atlantic during World War II. The vast expanse of ocean was difficult to patrol, and the German U-boats prowled the waters, sinking ships and disrupting the vital supply lines that connected North America to Europe. The only protection provided by each convoy were very few escort ships. The typical convoy consists of 40 to 50 ships, and the escort was usually a mixed bag of a destroyer or two, totaling 5 or 6 escort ships. Some escorts were from Allied navies, introducing language and doctrinal complications. Early in the war, escort groups were assigned at the last minute and had no workup period to learn to work together, resulting in very individual and non-coordinated warfare. The Allies needed to close the gap and secure the sea lanes if they wanted to win the war. The German perspective of the War of the Atlantic during World War II was one of defiance and determination. Despite being up against a powerful enemy with superior naval power, the German military and civilian population remained committed to the fight. From the German perspective, the War of the Atlantic was a struggle to break the British naval blockade and maintain their supply lines to keep the war effort alive. The German U-boat campaign was seen as a way to level the playing field and inflict heavy losses on the British Navy. However, as the war dragged on and the losses mounted, the German people became increasingly aware of the difficulty of their situation. The shortages of food, fuel, and other necessities due to the British blockade took a heavy toll on the civilian population. Despite these challenges, the German people remained resolute in their support of the war effort. They saw the War of the Atlantic as a necessary fight for their country's survival and were willing to make necessary sacrifices to ensure victory. On the other side, from the British perspective, the War of the Atlantic during World War II was a crucial struggle for survival. With Germany's naval power posing a serious threat to Britain's liveliness across the Atlantic, maintaining control of the seas was an essential effort. The British saw the War of the Atlantic as a fight to protect their vital shipping lanes and keep their country supplied with the resources it needed to continue the war. The Royal Navy, along with their allies, worked tirelessly to maintain a tight naval blockade on Germany and keep the U-boats at bay. Despite the danger posed by German submarines, the British people remained determined and resolute in the face of the threat. The war they saw of the Atlantic as a necessary battle to protect their way of life and secure their future. However, the war took a heavy toll on the British people as well. The loss of merchant ships and the constant danger posed by the U-boats created a sense of uncertainty and fear. Nevertheless, the British remained steadfast in their support of the war effort, showing remarkable resilience and determination in the face of adversity.
With this long-lasting conflict, one side had to eventually back down. Fortunately for the Allies, Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, making all German U-boats surrender in the following weeks.
World War II is a war that is greatly known as the bloodiest war in history. But why exactly did it end in so many deaths? A staggering count, including both the military and civilians of each country involved. Now, let's go back to the beginning of this tragedy.
The Germans were left humiliated and grim due to the wrenching loss of the previous World War I. The so-called war to end all wars would soon prove to be a very false statement. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to take the blame for initiating the conflict, along with paying heavy damage reparations to other nations. Their army and military size was forcibly decreased by a significant amount. Paying back the reparations took a toll on the economy and largely increased rates of inflation. Very soon, the country was in an economic depression. It was during this time frame that Adolf Hitler, a soldier who had fought in the previous war, decided to step up.
Numerous Germans had begun to blame the downfall of the country on the weak government, which set a fertile ground for a new leader. Hitler used this turmoil to make several public speeches and establish his own government party, the Nazis. Immediately following Hindenburg's death, he took over and appointed himself as the new chancellor.
After Hitler and his Nazi party had taken the power they needed to push for their agenda, they were able to move forward with their goals, the most prominent of which included expanding German territory into all of Europe, as well as suppress and eradicate people of Jewish faith both within Germany and its occupied territories. Hitler began pouring millions into rearming programs, tripling his armed force in size.
The Treaty of Versailles, that was supposed to have left Germany stripped of all military power, was proving to do little about these rising powers. With this strength, he began invading other countries to expand the boundaries of Germany and wiped many nations clean.
Hitler's strategy in the war was ultimately to make soldiers stand their ground in their positions and make it forbidden to surrender under any circumstances. This overall allowed the Germans to avoid mass confusion and disorganization during the Soviet counteroffensive in 1941 to 1942. However, this strategy wouldn't be as useful under the circumstances on the Eastern Front in 1943, where the Soviet troops had greatly outnumbered the Germans. By December of that year, there were about 3 million German troops and 5.5 million Soviet troops. The combined use of concentrated firepower, artillery, and tanks were all part of the strategy that the war effort of the Nazis had utilized. This, plus the use of Air Force, which determined their air superiority, had all established most of their successes. The coordinated attacks with the use of the materials resulted in the penetration of opponents' defenses on narrow fronts. Not only did the materials and artillery help with the war effort strategies, but the radio communications were essential in order for the blitzkrieg operations to be successful. This was because the radios allowed the commanders to plan out and coordinate different attacks and advances, all while keeping their opponents off balance.
September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland using these techniques, sparking the world conflict that is World War II. Shortly after the conquering of Czechoslovakia, Hitler set his sights on Poland, specifically the Free City of Danzig. This was an important port in the Baltic Sea and was originally a German city. After signing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which ensured that they would not interfere with the invasion, they conquered Poland. It was this day that both Britain and France declared war on Germany.
A year later, the invasion of France on May 10, 1940, was also a victory for Hitler. Since the French military and government were also weak from the First World War, their defenses were not sufficient enough to stop the Nazis. After they broke through the defense lines, they started towards the west and north. Poor communication between the Allies and the army led to the crumbling French confidence, and Germany succeeded in taking Paris on June 14th.
On the 10th of July to the 31st of October the same year, the Battle of Great Britain took place. It was fought between the air forces of the two countries, and one of the only battles of the war fought solely in the air. Germany had secretly trained and rebuilt an air force after World War I, even though the treaty forbade it. As a result, they had a strong and powerful air force called the Luftwaffe. Despite all the overwhelming victories so far, Germany went into battle unprepared, and the Royal Air Force was able to weaken the Luftwaffe. It was Hitler's first major loss of the war and became one of Britain's most significant defensive victories.
Operation Barbarossa, a crucial turning point in the war, was also a failure for Hitler and the Nazis due to manpower issues on the German side, as well as stretched supply lines and indomitable Soviet resistance. The name Operation Barbarossa itself was a code name for the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Soviet leadership was failing as a result of Stalin putting too much trust into the Russo-German non-aggression pact.
As a result of the continuous efforts throughout the 1940s, most of Europe west of the Soviet Union was under German control. The ongoing war was still being fought, and more deaths were being tallied every day. The war was a terrible tragedy as a result of Nazi Germany, led by Hitler and their conquering of power from other nations.
In this episode, we will discuss the significance of having command of the air and aerial superiority. Command of the air has been very significant for victory in wartime situations. The battle for air supremacy was exponentially growing with the rapid advancements of new aircraft that are now specifically designed for fighting, bombing, reconnaissance, and much more. With advancements in aircraft, so did the destruction of cities and loss of civilian life and overall non-military casualties. The countries in contention for air superiority at the time were Nazi Germany, Great Britain, Imperial Japan, and the United States of America.
Aircraft served countless purposes in World War II. Being a new innovation in the field of war, the aircraft industry in war was still in its infancy, despite its recent incursions in the battlefield of the European theater in the First World War. But, in the advent of metallic aircraft and stronger motors, the great military powers of the world had greater plans for the capabilities of aircraft in the Second World War. One class of aircraft which carried over from the close quarters engagement of the First World War was the fighter. These quick, maneuverable aircraft were employed by all types of combatants in World War II and were very versatile in their warfighting capabilities. Aircraft like these were fast, light, and stealthy, allowing them to be used in all kinds of aerial battles. For instance, planes such as the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 could be equipped to escort and protect bombers and their payloads in getting to an enemy outpost. And American aircraft, such as the legendary P-51, were used in close aerial combat, such as dogfights in the Battle of Okinawa and those in Pearl Harbor. These planes were also small, quick, and stealthy, allowing them to be used in reconnaissance operations, which allowed ground forces to better predict where the enemy could be on the battlefield before an engagement. All of this combined made fighters a deadly combination and contributed to the figure of over 51% of airmen dying in combat due to their introduction into air battles.
A newer kind of aircraft utilized in World War II was the transport aircraft, made possible through innovations to civilian aircraft during the time of peace. The modern advancement of machinery such as aircraft engines and metal bodies for civilian planes. These all accumulated into the rise of transport planes. These unarmed metal birds were often civilian aircraft that were put into service by their respective countries. They could carry large amounts of munitions, supplies, and even soldiers across the battlefield high above the ground. This enabled units such as the 82nd Airborne Division to come into existence and utilize such planes to airdrop over a battlefield, allowing insertion into a combat zone without the risk of a ground approach. Airborne units such as the Rikusentai Japanese Marines employed in island defense in the Pacific Theater during the early 1940s.
Bombers were another type of aircraft converted from other civilian planes, but were equipped with highly explosive payloads of bombs and other droppable materials. These beasts were often used to pummel civilian areas and devastate industrial sectors important for wartime production. And some bombers, such as those in the Royal Air Force and American Air Force, could be equipped with a maximum payload of over 100,000 pounds of explosive munitions. These, while being an effective way to dispatch an enemy factory or Japanese outpost, also came at the cost of civilian lives due to the cities and towns that were often in the paths of these massive war machines. With the new advancement of bomber planes, such as the British Lancaster bomber, urban bombing became a very mainstream practice throughout World War II. Hundreds of bombers would fly in unison, usually accompanied by some kind of fighter, and would drop thousands of pounds of bombs onto massively populated cities that mostly had regular citizens and were not involved in the military. Moving towards the end of the war, militaries believed that more drastic measures were needed to win, and the method they found were firebombs. Firebombs were made of napalm and phosphorus, each explosive causing a massive uncontrollable fire. This was especially bad for Japan when the United States began firebombing Tokyo in March of 1945. During this, 300 B-29 bombers scrambled and had the intent to burn down the entire city of Tokyo in order to turn the tide of war. On that night, thousands of tons of incendiary explosives were dropped in the Japanese capital, and roughly 100,000 people perished in the battle. But the most devastating part of the bombings was that about 1 million regular civilians lost their homes during the firestorms that it caused.
While this event was terrible for people living in Japan, it was not the only instance of large-scale urban bombing campaigns. In 1943, the country of England had been bombed by Nazi Germany on repeated occasions, and in retaliation, the Royal Air Force launched a bombing campaign against the German city of Hamburg. Hamburg was once Nazi Germany's largest industrial city that built millions of weapons, fighter aircraft, and tanks. In July of 1943, roughly 800 bombers were deployed, and on the first day dropped about 3,000 tons of explosives that mostly contained incendiary chemicals in them. By the end of the week-long raid, about 10,000 pounds of bombs were dropped and killing thousands of German citizens who lived in the city. This had a massive morale impact on German military and citizens alike and was a factor in their overall defeat in World War II. One of the final and most devastating battles of World War II was the bombing of Dresden. In 1945, in February, the Royal Air Force of England and the U.S. Army Air Corps bombed the German industrial capital Dresden. 800 aircraft dropped roughly 4,000 tons of conventional along with incendiary bombs. 25,000 people died in the bombing, and this completely destroyed the city, laying waste to the entire population. This ended up crippling the weapons and ammo supply for Nazi Germany along in the war.
All in all, while the the advancement of wartime aircraft was a major feat for the victory of the Allied powers and was a way in which they were able to defeat their Axis enemies, it also came at a cost and a heavy sacrifice of civilians and a higher military death toll overall than previous wars without them, such as seen in the fire bombings of Japan and the increased dogfighting casualties.
On December 7, 1941, Japan launched an attack on the U.S. naval base Pearl Harbor. The day following this, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan, bringing America into World War II. This was a miscalculation on Japan's part because this helped greatly contribute to Japan losing the war. Japan also made many other miscalculations throughout the war, and they will be explained throughout this video.
On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise air attack on U.S. naval base Pearl Harbor. In the summer of 1940, the U.S. began to restrict the amount of materials useful in war that were exported into Japan. In July of 1941, the U.S. severed all financial and commercial relationships with Japan. The U.S. also declared an embargo on shipments of petroleum and other vital war materials into Japan. Japan and the U.S. tried to negotiate to find peace but couldn't, eventually leading to the attack of the U.S. This is one of Japan's biggest miscalculations as it brought the United States into World War II.
Now, throughout the entirety of World War II in both the European theater and the Pacific theater, the U.S. and the USSR had a relation through the fact that they were both a member of the Allied forces. Now, is this a miscalculation on Japan's part or America's part? Now, you could see through, depending on what looking glass you're going through, you can see that it could be a miscalculation for possibly both. But we're specifically talking about Japan. Now, why is this a miscalculation on Japan's part? Because previous to the war, they had already become enemies with China and the countries closest to them. So they already were lacking allies that were in close proximity to themselves. And because of Russia and America aligning and becoming allied, that affected them because now America not only had control of the Southern Pacific near Japan, but Russia could also come from the north and attack Japan. And this is a miscalculation because Japan had no allies and could not really defend themselves in a very effective manner due to the fact that they had both America and the USSR in a relation that are both against Japan due to them being part of the Axis forces.
So, what was the Battle of Midway?
The Battle of Midway was a battle between the United States and Japan for the U.S. island Midway. Midway is an island located in the Central Pacific Ocean around 1,300 miles away from Hawaii. In the 1940s, the United States built major air and submarine bases on the island. Japan realized that control of the island would be critical for their plans in the Central Pacific, as well as the fact the U.S. military presence in Hawaii would be seriously threatened if Japan could take Midway. Japan actually did try to take the island just hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor, but they weren't successful. Later, the U.S. found out that the Japanese plan to invade Midway was existent after breaking the Japanese JN-25 naval code, giving America time to prepare for the attack. Even though they had time to prepare, the commander-in-chief of the Navy could only get 3 ships ready for the battle, and they weren't aircraft carriers, not even battleships. Fortunately, though, America was able to get 115 planes and 18 submarines prepared for the attack.
As Japanese ships were approaching, U.S. dispatched bombers, which were not able to hit the moving Japanese fleet but were still useful, as they could track the fleet while staying out of range of the ship's guns. Early on June 4th, the battle really heated up, as United States planes shot at Japanese planes and engaged. Although the U.S. pilots were outnumbered 4-1, they held the Japanese off. But they paid the price as they lost more than half of their planes. Later, the aerial bombardment of Midway began, as the Japanese attacked the island for around an hour and a half. The U.S. would then launch 2 attacks, which were not very successful. As the second wave of U.S. planes were returning, the Japanese found out the U.S. naval fleet contained an aircraft carrier.
The Japanese decided to clear their flight deck and have returning planes refuel and attack the U.S. ships. Many planes were sent out to attack Japanese aircraft carriers, but couldn't locate them, so they had to turn back. But instead of telling the planes to turn back, the U.S. made one of the most important decisions of the battle in telling their planes to continue their search instead of refueling. The U.S. overlapped their attacks when they located the Japanese ship. Their earlier torpedo attack was concluding. Almost at the same time, a different U.S. aircraft carrier dispatched another group of planes and they attacked another Japanese aircraft carrier. In minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers had been hit and hit hard.
Within the loss of the aircraft carriers, Japan lost some of its greatest military leaders, as in Japanese culture it was cowardly to escape a sinking ship and live. So, some of their officers went down with their ships. One of these officers was Taman Yamaguchi, a Japanese admiral that decided to go down with his ship. This battle was a massive turning point as the Japanese lost many of their experienced fighter pilots. Not only that, but also 4 carriers, a heavy cruiser, and more than 320 planes. As most of the Japanese fleet was destroyed, they didn't have the time to look for survivors, which let the Americans find them and interrogate them. They were provided with vital information about the Japanese naval capabilities. This was a major miscalculation, as before the fight, the Japanese had all the momentum in the war as well as a much bigger navy. But after the fight, the navy sizes were similar, and all of the momentum had completely shifted in favor of the United States, completely changing the outcome of the war.
The Battle of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima was a battle in the Pacific that lasted from February 19, 1945 to March 26 of 1945 for a total of a month and exactly a week. The Battle of Iwo Jima was known as the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. The Battle of Iwo Jima included the deaths of 18,844 out of 22,060 Japanese soldiers on the island, and Operation Detachment, also known as the Battle of Iwo Jima, cost U.S. forces 6,871 killed and 19,217 wounded. Medals of Honor were awarded to 27 American men from this battle, 22 Marines and 5 Navy sailors, 14 of these being posthumous. The Battle of Iwo Jima was very significant for the American war effort because it served as an emergency landing site for more than 2,200 B-29 bombers, saving the lives of 24,000 U.S. airmen. The Battle of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa was from April 1st to June 21st of 1945, and with that being said, it was only a little bit under 2 months before the end of World War II. The Battle of Okinawa was dubbed the Typhoon of Steel due to its ferocity. The Battle of Okinawa was also one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific War. Deaths of 12,000 Americans and 100,000 Americans, including the commanding generals on both sides, helped contribute to give it this name. Why is this important? Because it greatly affected the war effort on both sides. The Battle of Okinawa was very important for America because it got them closer to the Japanese home islands, which also links it to it being a miscalculation on Japan, because it got America closer to their home islands, which would also eventually contribute to them losing the war.
Operation Downfall could have been another huge miscalculation. Thankfully, it never happened. Well, kind of. The idea of Operation Downfall was to force Japan to surrender as soon as possible. Operation Downfall was a plan the great Allied powers created to invade the Japanese home islands. The operation was made up of 2 attacks. Operation Olympic would have led to the island Kyushu being captured, while Operation Coronet planned to take the Kanto Plain. It is estimated that the 2 attacks would have led to 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths, with around 1.7 to 4 million U.S. casualties. In those casualties, around 400,000 to 800,000 Americans would die. Ultimately, the plan was called off as atomic bombs were favored. Atomic bombs were favored as there would be far less casualties. This would have been a major miscalculation, as not only it could have failed, but also so many American lives would be lost.
Around September 18, 1931, tensions began to rise in Asia. World War II hadn't started yet, but Japan was beginning to take over new territory. Seeking raw materials to fuel its growing industries, Japan invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria, further raising tensions. Skip ahead a few years, and we can see that Japan dropped out of the Five-Power Treaty, originally in place to halt the race to build warships after World War I. While the US criticized this action, there were no punishments that came with it. Skip ahead a few more years, and Japan was still on the attack. Mid-1941, Japan signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, making it clear that the Japanese military would be moving into Southeast Asia. The Franco-Japanese Accord enabled Japanese forces to move into Indochina and begin their southern advance. The United States responded to this growing threat by halting negotiations with Japanese diplomats, instituting a full embargo on exports to Japan, and freezing Japanese assets in U.S. banks. The US demanded that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina, which encouraged Japan to begin planning for an attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, officially brought the United States into World War II. During the attack, Japan sunk several ships, destroyed hundreds of planes, and ended thousands of American lives. Following the attack, years of fighting a Pacific War brought the US Armed Forces closer and closer to Japan. The last major battle, the fight for Okinawa, lasted almost 3 months and took more than 100,000 Japanese and American lives.
April 12, 1945. President Roosevelt sadly passes away, but fighting is still happening, so Harry Truman must take the lead. Japan needed to be confronted, but the method by which it would be done was the dilemma. The Pacific War had shown that the Japanese were fighting hard and would rather die than surrender. Women and children had been taught how to kill with basic weapons, and Japanese kamikaze pilots could turn planes into guided missiles. The cost of an invasion would be high, in lives, time, and material. However, Truman then looked into the Manhattan Project, a secret scientific effort to create an atomic bomb. After seeing a successful test of the bomb, Truman ordered it to be used on Japan if they wouldn't surrender. The Japanese were presented with the Potsdam Declaration, and 11 days passed with no reply. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber named the Enola Gay dropped a bomb named Little Boy on Hiroshima. There were roughly 80,000 deaths in just the first few minutes, and thousands who later died from radiation. On August 9, 1945, another bomber was en route to Japan. Only this time they were heading for Nagasaki with Fat Man, another atomic bomb. The result this time? 39,000 men, women, and children were killed. 25,000 more were injured. Even today, we still wonder, was this the right choice?
Now that we have a good idea of the time period and how the US's decision developed, let's examine a few different perspectives from some expert historians. We will examine two separate viewpoints, one that supports the US's decision to drop the atomic bombs and one that does not.
From my perspective, the US's decision to drop the atomic bombs was a well-calculated one that was called for in the context of the time. During this time period, the Japanese emperor was regarded as a living god, and he had convinced the citizens that it was better for them to die than to surrender. Non-soldiers had also been taught to kill with basic weapons, and Japanese kamikaze pilots could easily turn planes into guided missiles. Thus, the cost of an invasion would have been extremely high. When you look at the US's options, Truman could have either physically invaded or he could have dropped the atomic bombs. A physical invasion would have been extremely dangerous for the US, with experts estimating the loss of 500,000 lives of soldiers, sailors, and Marines. 500,000. Take D-Day, for example, where tens of thousands of troops died in the invasion of Normandy. Additionally, the atomic bombs served as a military necessity in order to end the war. With the combination of Japanese barbarism and prior losses in Europe, an invasion would have been far too risky, and the atomic bomb was clearly the choice that would quickly and effectively end the war. Japan also refused to surrender, proving the use of this force necessary. After the announcement of the Potsdam Declaration, Japan was warned of the brutal consequences of refusing to surrender, yet they still chose not to. At this point, only such brutal force could get Japan to surrender and truly end the war.
On the topic of the US's choice to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I am here to convince you of why the decision was extremely unnecessary and why it should be criticized to this day. While I believe this for several reasons, most of them boil down to one fairly self-explanatory reason. The bombs caused mass citizen death and were inherently immoral. Looking back on it, their intentional targeting of civilians and their use of weapons for mass destruction was plainly unethical. In order to taking roughly 200,000 lives and giving citizens long-term health consequences, the bombs set off a dangerous precedent for the use of nuclear weapons. Additionally, I believe that the bombings were militarily unnecessary during that point in the war. The sheer level of destruction caused by the bombs was completely disproportionate to the necessary force that should have been taken. As opposed to the mass destruction, I believe that a more peaceful route could have been taken and that the war could have been ended through diplomatic means. For an alternate solution, I believe that a naval blockade and conventional bombings would have sufficed as well. No matter how you tell the story, it comes down to the unnecessary and immoral sacrifice made by the United States government.
The United States deprived American-born Japanese citizens of their constitutionally granted rights due to conspiracy and fear, forcing them to sacrifice their civil rights and liberties in order to protect America as a country. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service held an attack against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu in 1941. Conspiracy was sparked upon American-born Japanese citizens for espionage, sabotage, and opposed as a threat. President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed Executive Order 9066 into law in 1942. This forced everyone with a Japanese descent, including American-born citizens, into internment camps. The War Relocation Authority, WRA, was set up to organize relocation of Japanese Americans. They had a 6-day notice, losing their jobs, businesses, and personal property in the process. After their notice was up, they were ordered to report to temporary facilities set up in isolated areas. These were normally stables and pens for livestock. They were held there for months in permanent housing camps called relocation centers. There were a total of 10 camps that they could be sent to. Families were forced to move into overcrowded barracks with limited access to communal facilities, food, and resources.
Many camps resembled a normal community life as it had newspapers, businesses, sports teams, concerts, place of worship, with each camp having a governing council. Students went to school every morning. Adult internees were given jobs, farming or maintaining the physical plant. Armed guards and snipers in watchtowers were in charge of any attempts or perceived attempts to escape could get one shot and killed. Medical care was limited and the prisoners were treated poorly. Physical punishment wasn't uncommon, but tear gas was used on the prisoners who violated rules. Since were addressed towards higher powers than speculation and fear after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 1941, attempting to bring attention to the conspiring concerns of the presence of the enemy aliens that resided in communities. Several Americans expressed their desire for protection from potential sabotage. Widespread panic among the United States military and government of the potential espionage, threat, and skepticism because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, even of Japanese Americans, even those who were citizens. The President and the U.S. Congress supported the confinement and relocation of people of Japanese ancestry.
The evacuation and internment of Japanese Americans, including native-born American citizens, by the United States government during World War II resulted in major challenges being brought before the U.S. Supreme Court. Korematsu v. United States, Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution were all brought to attention on constitutionality of internment. Multiple confinees challenged the constitutionality of the law, which eventually led to the release of Japanese American citizens. The U.S. government studied the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which allows the president to imprison citizens of enemy countries during a time of war or in response to threats of invasion or attack. They ruled that the detention was a military necessity and was not based on race. Korematsu v. the United States, 1944. Korematsu asked the Supreme Court of the United States to hear his case. On December 18, 1944, a divided Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that the detention was a military necessity and not based on race. This was one of the many cases brought to the Supreme Court's attention that validated the release of Japanese Americans. Korematsu argued that the confinement violated his Fifth Amendment rights. Using another precedent set by Hirabayashi versus United States. The Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Japanese Americans did not get a fair individual trial. The Fifth Amendment forbids the government from taking away citizens' freedom without due process by forcing Japanese Americans into internment camps as a group without charging them or convicting them of crimes individually. The government violated the Fifth Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states, no person shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. The Equal Protection Clause is used to guarantee that individuals are treated equally regardless of their race, gender, religion, nationality, or other characteristics. It requires the government to provide equal rights to all citizens. President Roosevelt's executive order violates the Equal Protection Clause because it unfairly targets Japanese American citizens. The United States was also at war with Germany and Italy, but German and Italian Americans were not forced into internment camps.
In the post-war years, these Japanese Americans had to rebuild their lives. The U.S. citizens and longtime residents who had been incarcerated had lost their personal liberties, and many also lost their homes, businesses, properties, and savings. Their forced sacrifice of their liberties left them in ruins. Life was difficult for those who had lived in the internment camps. freed internees still faced racial discrimination even after they left. Moreover, as most of their properties and homes had been seized, many had to live in poverty or return to Japan. Internment was ceased, but Japanese Americans still had to endure the struggle reclaiming their freedom. Many homes, savings, and lives were taken away. While correcting prior acts, there were still many long-term and damaging effects. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which gave an official apology to the Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II, along with reparations to each survivor of the camps.
A war of attrition is a war in which a nation slowly wears down their opponent to such a great extent that their will to fight collapses. This includes forcing physical collapse through loss of continuous personnel, equipment, and supplies. World War II was, on the North African and primarily European front, a war of attrition. The war of attrition was, again, a war of sacrifice because the Allies weren't very well equipped against the Germans. So although they were victorious, they sacrificed many of their military for this victory.
This sacrifice can be seen in the various methods in which these battles were fought and the overall outcomes of the war in general. During this episode, we would like to outline the Operation Torch, Allied invasion of Italy, French resistance, D-Day, Battle of Budge, and the race to Berlin.
The Operation Torch was the Allied forces' invasion of North Africa. The attack was their first major attack on the Nazis. They invaded Morocco, Algeria, and up to the Mediterranean. The Allied forces were composed of 3 task forces, one in Casablanca, one in Oran, and one in Algiers. The goal of this operation was to use North Africa for further operations against the Axis powers, and as well to gain access to the Mediterranean Sea. During this battle, the Allied forces slowly wore down their opponents until they successfully invaded Morocco and Algeria, and until they forced the French North African Command to sign an armistice.
The Italian invasion of Italy was a series of beach landings and land battles from southern Italy up to the main Italy with the Nazis' influence. Most fighting took place in Anzio, Salinaro, and Monte Cassino. Allied forces decided to launch an attack on Italy due to their massive Mediterranean resources. Although the Italians fell quickly and Benedict Mussolini was arrested, the Germans persisted. The fighting was bitter, long, and costly because both sides were relatively evenly matched. The Germans refused to give up, and in the end, although the Allies won this battle, the cost was very high.
Next up, the French resistance. During this battle, multiple Allied nations fought together to prevent the Nazis' occupation of France. France wanted to attack the Germans when possible, and their main goal was to help the Allies. Specifically, they helped the Allied prisoners and soldiers escape from the Nazis. They attacked Germans and put them down so they could help the Allied prisoners, which would be seen as a war of attrition, especially because France is wearing down the opposing side, just so it would be easier for them to accomplish freeing the trapped people in Germany.
The D-Day battle is also a prime example of the war of attrition. D-Day, or the Normandy landings, were essential to the Allied victory of World War II. The battle primarily took place between the Americans and the Germans. The Allied troops landed on Normandy, the Cotentin Peninsula in the northwest of France. The initial objective of this campaign was to liberate Europe and defeat Germany. Even though the Germans had more experience and convenient terrain, due to Hitler's refusal to give up, the Allied forces had a more complete victory than they could ever hope for. However, due to the fact that our military was largely inexperienced, we paid a large price for this victory. This battle is also one of sacrifice because in order to wear down the Germans, the Allies threw more and more American soldiers at the Germans, many of whom died during the process.
The Battle of Berlin was primarily between the Soviets and the German army. The Soviet forces pushed into Berlin and overran the German defense in the north. After a long period of war, the casualty rates for Soviets were way higher than Germany's. The war of attrition could be seen in this because the Soviets had worn out Germany to be able to get a hold of and take control of Berlin. They overran Germany and brought loss to them as an opponent for the benefit of them. Their focus was to drain out the other side's army and try to bring great damage to them so they could help themselves.
The Battle of Bulge was the single largest battle in the Western Front, and it marked the last German offense. The losses Germany had prevented them from resisting the advance of Allied forces. During the battle, unfortunately, many American and Belgian soldiers/prisoners were murdered. 4 months after the battle, Germany had finally surrendered to the Allied forces. This could be seen as a war of attrition because it was characterized by poor weather and watery, muddy grounds. Germans created a bulge around the areas in the forest to push the Americans' defensive line. This bulge line lasted long enough to wear down the American soldiers, causing many military deaths.
The War of Attrition on the European front was long, deadly, and very brutal. And although it ultimately led to the victory of the Allied forces, it also sacrificed many brave soldiers in the process.
Over the course of the late 1930s and 1940s, World War II and its drastic effects spread around the world. While the war began, the United States government attempted to keep an isolationist view on the war, avoiding conflict if possible. As the U.S. faced the Great Depression, many believed that isolationism would be best fit for the country. The public shared these opinions, and the government continued to work to avoid military and political conflicts while still economically expanding and protecting its interests.
While the country was preparing to go into war, civil rights activists threatened to organize a march on Washington in order to protest segregation in the armed forces. The threat brought attention to the discrimination surrounding the workforce and the military. President Roosevelt issued an executive order which prohibited discrimination in the employment of men due to their race. Because of this order, Black Americans were able to serve in the war. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Native Americans enlisted into the Army, including women. Native Americans wanted to fight for their country, stating that they wanted to protect the nation as well as their ancestral homeland. Hispanic Americans also fought in the war, but they were not segregated into separate units like African American men, which often makes their history in war overlooked. Segregation in the nation continued to be attacked as all men were able to serve and work in power.
As Britain fought against Nazi Germany, they needed guns, planes, steel, food, and many other articles of defense. About 3,000 miles away, the United States had all of the materials to help their allies, but no legal way of transporting the material. The United States then signed the Land-Lease Act, which allowed the U.S. to transport material for Britain and later the Soviet Union in legal means.
Sometime later, Japan bombed U.S. Pearl Harbor, which ended isolationist views from the country and pushed the United States into World War II. As American men left their homes to fight for their country against Nazi Germany, the home front of the United States was left with major differences. In the beginning of the war, gender roles were strict as to how a woman should act like, look like, or work as. Then women began to take up the jobs that men had left, now working as lumberjacks, shell loaders, crane operators, aircraft makers, tool makers, and many more.
This solves the breadwinning problem for many families whose men are at war.
The song that has been playing in the background, Rosie the Riveter, represents the women who were in the workforce displaying their patriotic aspects.
All the day long, where the rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the Riveter, keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage.
Women helped create and provide materials for their country. Many women also worked in the Army Nurse Corps. While their husbands were away, women worked for wages to support themselves and their family. To the men that remained in the workforce, women were threatening to change the ideal of male providers versus female caretakers. Women faced harassment from men who didn't want to work with women, which led to employers separating men from women in the workplace. This also led to a gap in pay, as women earned far less than men did.
As production levels needed to be increased in order to meet the demands of war, workers had to work long and tiring hours with little safety restrictions. Prices increased on the materials that they produced, but workers' wages remained around the same. Workers began to go on strike, and Congress responded with the Smith-Connolly Act of 1943. With this act, the federal government was able to seize industries threatened by strikes in order to protect production. As soldiers fought in war, men in the workplace wanted to prove that they, too, were real men. They emphasized the threat and dangers of working. Government and industry propaganda of the male workers supported the idea of a muscular laborer as the equivalent of a soldier, and the worker was essential to a soldier's success.
On top of all the mental and physical distresses of World War II, the citizens of the United States were obligated to follow the ration systems implemented to maintain the conservation of supplies. The saying, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without, portrays the hardships of rationing due to the increased demand of materials during the war. Well, what was rationed? Was it that serious? It was very serious. People weren't even allowed to buy tires for their cars or just purchase a seemingly simple thing like a bicycle. In addition to these items, gas, sugar, coffee, meats, fats, canned fish, cheese, and canned milk had been rationed as well. Civilians had ration cards that would enable them to even purchase some food, but were also encouraged to plant their own vegetables and cans for food, such as displayed in this propaganda poster. The ration limitations went so far that people had sold simple things nowadays like tires and meat in black market trading. What could people even buy then? Well, Kraft mac and cheese, yes, the mac and cheese everyone loves today, grew in popularity. During the war, about 50 million boxes were sold because of how cheap they were, about only 19 cents.
So after quite a little wait, you get yourself a ration book number 2, which entitles you to 48 points of groceries each.
Throughout the course of World War II, all countries went through sacrifices that changed their course of history. The United States sacrificed materials in war and went through many challenges on their home front due to World War II.
Stalin took power in the Soviet Union in 1929 after fighting his way into a government leadership position. He declared himself the dictator of the country and the leader of the Communist Party. He was able to come into power by swaying and manipulating the Soviet population with the rise of the Nazi Party and militaristic beliefs in Japan. These growing powers were seen as threats to the country's power, so Stalin tried to get rid of those in the country that contribute to the potential collapse of the Union. Stalin's motives involved the idea of winning no matter what since the start of his dictatorship. Sacrificing his own citizens to the power of the country is a part of his beliefs to rebuild the Soviet Union.
He viewed any other political parties as threats and would hurt the positive impact he viewed the Communist Party of having. He started to organize the deaths of high-ranked officials to remove more threats. Stalin even executed 30,000 members of his own Red Army because he thought they planted a coup. He even executed children as young as 12 years old. Some people were even sent to labor camps, where they were later executed.
Under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union showed great military strength against Germany, but in the process paid the price with their own citizens, including both civilians and the military. Though the Soviets won, the people did not get treated much better under Stalin than if they were under the Nazi Party. Under his control, many civilians suffered.
For example, the scorched earth policy was a policy that was followed by the Red Army and German Army from direct orders from Stalin and Hitler themselves. The policy itself is a military command that while troops were retreating, they must destroy anything in their path that could be used by the enemy. They destroyed anything that was a resource like food, water, communication locations, manufacturing, and energy.
Factories were demolished. The biggest hydroelectric dam at the time was bombed, and farmers were ordered to surrender animals and crops to the military. This led to many of the Soviets' own civilians to die from starvation and left the economy in horrible condition in Ukraine.
This war on the Eastern Front between the Soviet Union and Germany had more civilian deaths than those of military casualties.
The Eastern Theater in Europe was home to the major battles of World War II, as well as serving as the main reason for the defeat of the Nazi Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Moscow all ended in Soviet victories, but the Soviets seemed to be the ones who lost the most. The Soviet Union's army, also known as the Red Army, fought against Germany's Sixth Army and the Axis powers on the Eastern Front.
The battle was caused by an imperfect offensive intended to give Hitler power over the Caucasus for its oil-rich territory. Fighting started between the Don River and Volga, reaching the outskirts of Stalingrad by September. At one point, Germany controlled about 90% of Stalingrad, but by then the Soviets had strengthened the city's defenses and created a counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. The operation's objective was to trap and destroy the Sixth Army, letting them bleed dry inside the city.
The fighting ended with the Germans starved and too weak to fight, sending their last troops to the Red Army. 91,000 troops were surrendered, and about 800,000 Axis forces were found dead. While the Red Army had an obvious victory, they suffered about 1.1 million soldier casualties from defending Stalingrad and about 40,000 civilian deaths.
The Soviet Union's second largest city and important production center for armaments, Leningrad, was under siege for 872 days during World War II. The city was besieged by German and Finnish armies. Leningrad was sealed off on September 8th of 1941 as Germany launched its first massive aerial attack. Almost 600,000 people were able to evacuate before the Germans gained major control. But there were still about 2.5 million people trapped inside the city.
Hitler's plan was to blockade, bombard, and starve those inside the city, seizing it afterwards. Leningrad's supply of raw materials, food, and fuel started to decrease rapidly. On top of that, the only food available was bread, and even then the rations were much smaller than any subsequent meal. The starvation claimed as many as 100,000 lives per month.
Lake Ladoga gained the name the Road of Life, as it served as the Soviets' only connection to those trapped. When it froze over, it was able to be used as a food transportation system to the people still stuck inside the city. That transportation pathway allowed almost 600,000 trapped people to evacuate the city. By this time, the population in Leningrad was almost down to 1 million from its initial 3 million people, all due to the evacuations and starvation. It wasn't until January of 1943 that the Red Army managed to break part of the blockade and regain control over a narrow corridor along the coast of Lake Ladoga. The siege continued for almost another year as the Germans continued to gun down Leningrad and their new railway from a closer range. In January of 1944, the blockade finally fell through, and along the Soviet front, the Germans retreated. If the Soviets did not have a strong strategic defense, Germany could have been able to capture the Soviet capital. Although by the book the Soviets walked out victorious, the siege killed about 800,000 civilians and over 1.5 million people in total.
The Battle of Moscow started in September of 1941 and ended in April of 1942, marking the Soviets' attempt to stop a disastrous collapse threatening to occur if the Germans captured Moscow. The Germans hoped to seize Moscow, the Soviet capital, before winter, as they believed the fall of Moscow would lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. With the goal, they brought 1.8 million troops, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 cannons, and 1,390 aircraft to Moscow. The enormous army quickly took advantage of the Soviet forces, capturing several towns in the first week of their journey to the capital. By October, the German army was frighteningly close to Moscow.
The Red Army began to stiffen their defense around the capital with the help of General Georgy Zhukov, who previously led the Soviets to victory in Leningrad. Initially, Germany was extremely successful with the captures of areas around Moscow, but the Soviets' consistent defense and the harshness of Russian winter slowed their advance. This allowed the Soviets to recover and begin their counterattacks. These planned attacks were successful in driving the Germans back at least 20 to 40 miles.
In many places, German forces retreated due to being weakened by their exposure to winter and ongoing supply problems. So during this time, the Red Army was able to advance almost 200 miles into German-held territory.
Eventually, the Red Army was finally able to drive the Germans away from Moscow. This was the first real setback the Germans had faced since World War II began. In total, 2.5 million people were either killed, taken prisoner, missing, or severely wounded, with 1.9 million of those people from the Soviet side. The Soviets had just gained a massive win, knocking Germany back farther than they had ever been able to before, but the death toll the Soviets faced made the victory feel like nothing.
As mentioned before, the Soviets had to create many counteroffensives needed to push back against the multitude of Germany's attacks. Operation Uranus had the goal of circling the 6th Army and letting them bleed out dry outside the city, looking to destroy the Germans before they destroyed themselves. Operation Migration was used to move German army defenses back several thousands of kilometers. The main objective of pushing Germany back was essential, but keeping Hitler and his generals off balance, as well as getting the remaining Soviet territory out of Germany's control, helped make the counteroffensives worth it. The counteroffensives led out by the Soviets slowly weakened the Germans, eventually helping the Soviets stop Hitler from having unstoppable power. But like the rest of battles, victory came with a toll.
Every nation involved in World War II was forced to make tremendous sacrifices for the hope of peace. As a result of World War I, Great Britain and France struggled with financial and military population issues. The Soviet Union suffered massive food shortages and economic difficulties. The United States returned to its shell of isolationism to focus on internal improvements.
However, with all nations desperate for peace, they came together to negotiate various ideologies to bring a peaceful end to their sacrifices and suffering through wartime peace conferences. Some of the most significant conferences were Casablanca, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, both during and after World War II. The actions taken at the wartime conferences were important in ending the war, as only the Allied powers were included in the decisions made, which created conflict with the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend was a deal made between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain to ally against Germany, Italy, and Japan. It formed following the Nazi defeat of France in June of 1940 as Roosevelt started to grow weary of the aggression increasing among the Germans and wanted to improve relationships with the Soviet Union. The most important factor that got the Soviets to enter the alliance was when the Nazis made the decision to launch an invasion on the Soviet Union in June of 1941. However, it did only last 4 years as problems did come up that threatened the alliance. These different problems included the Soviet refusal to aid the Polish Home Army during the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944, the decision that British and U.S. officials made to exclude the Soviets from secret negotiations with German officers in March of 1945, and the most important being the opening of a second front in the West.
The Casablanca Conference was held in a suburban hotel outside of Casablanca, and it lasted from January 13th through the 14th in 1943. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill attended. Joseph Stalin was also invited, but he could not attend due to German conflicts. This conference was a crucial point in grand strategy and Allied war policy, as they decided how the Allied grand strategy would blend British and U.S. offensive concepts. It signified the finalization of the Allied strategic plans against the Axis powers in 1943. The idea of unconditional surrender was also introduced, which stated that anyone who chooses to surrender are not given any terms. Roosevelt and Churchill believed that this was the only way to avoid another situation similar to Germany in the Treaty of Versailles.
The major disagreement that occurred between the leaders was whether to focus on military attacks on the Axis powers in Europe coming through Italy or launching an attack on the European mainland across the English Channel. Many argue that this conference was controversial because not all leaders from all countries involved in the war were present, so the terms were not beneficial to all countries.
The Tehran Conference, held in the Iranian capital between November 28th and December 1st, 1943, saw UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the US President Franklin Roosevelt, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin meet together for the first time in person to discuss military strategy and the post-war world order.
The three discussed military issues such as the establishment of a second front in Europe and the timing of the Soviet entry into the war against Japan.
Similar to the Casablanca Conference, Japan, Italy, and Germany were not present. They were at a disadvantage because the Allied powers were discussing strategies to defeat them. However, they were unaware of this. Essentially, they had no input and were being set up for failure. Stalin and Churchill discussed the future borders of Poland and settled on the Curtin Line in the east and the Oder-Easternise Line in the west. Roosevelt had asked to be excused from any discussion of Poland out of consideration for the effects of any decision on Polish voters in the U.S. and the upcoming 1944 election. The decision was therefore not ratified until the Potsdam Conference of 1945. The Yalta Conference was held on the Crimean coast between February 4th and 11th, 1945, where the three premiers met in person for the second time. They got President Roosevelt's agreement with Churchill and Stalin at the conference. With victory for the Allied powers in sight, discussions focused on the reorganization of the countries following the war's conclusion. Other issues considered included denazification and the punishment of war criminals, German reparations, and the shape of the future international organization set to replace the League of Nations.
they agreed to the priority of the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. After the war, Germany and Berlin would be split into 4 occupied zones. Stalin agreed that France would have a 4th occupation zone in Germany if it was formed from the American and British zones. Roosevelt wanted Soviet support in the Pacific War against Japan, specifically for the planned invasion of Japan, as well as Soviet participation in the United Nations. He hoped that if the Soviets entered the Pacific War against Japan with the Allies, the war would end sooner and reduce American casualties. Churchill pressed for free elections and democratic governments in Central and Eastern Europe, specifically Poland. The Soviets agreed to more Polish independence. Stalin demanded a Soviet sphere of political influence in Eastern and Central Europe as an essential aspect of Soviet's national security strategy.
The Potsdam Conference was the last of the 3 major war summits that took place in Potsdam, to the southwest of Berlin, after Germany's unconditional surrender. The longest of the 3, the Potsdam Conference was held between the 17th of July and the 2nd of August 1945. It saw discussions between Stalin, who remained in power in the Soviet Union, and new U.S. and UK leaders. The U.S. was represented by President Harry Truman, who had come into the office on Roosevelt's death in April. The UK was represented by the successive UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, the change taking place midway through the conference after the 1945 general election.
In relation to the ongoing war in Asia, the US and UK issued a separate declaration in late July alongside China, demanding Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender. The Soviet Union would declare war on Japan in August. This warned that the alternative would be prompt and utter destruction for the country. Decisions centered around questions arising from Germany's defeat, while participants also considered the continuing war against Japan. They agreed that the status of a demilitarized and disarmed Germany under 4 zones of Allied occupation.
Despite the end of the war in Europe, neither President Harry Truman nor Clement Attlee, who midway through the conference replaced Churchill, could come to an agreement with Stalin on any but the most minor issues. The most significant agreement was the issuance of the Potsdam Declaration to Japan, demanding an immediate and unconditional surrender and threatening Japan with destruction if they did not comply. With the Axis forces defeated, the wartime alliance soon turned into suspicion and bitterness on both sides. These national leaders discussed the current war events and debated on which ideologies would work best to pursue their goal of peace in Casablanca, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam conferences.